Lovely to see all of your locations and enthusiasm. So welcome everyone. My name's Rachel and I'm from the GCC, the Global Compassion Coalition. And tonight we have a very special event. Well, it's nighttime for me, but it's afternoon for you guys probably. So today we have a very special event around the US elections. So this event is a collaboration between the Global Compassion Coalition and Living Room Conversations, who are a fantastic organisation who connect people and communities to build trust, understanding and belonging. And they have a fantastic library of resources to assist individuals and communities in having conversations that are maybe difficult and finding ways to bridge divides and find common ground. So thank you to Living Room Conversations for joining us. And I'll just kind of let you know the sort of rundown of today's session. So we'll be doing we'll be having a presentation from one of our speakers. So I'll introduce everyone in just a moment. And then we're going to go into a panel discussion. So we'll be hearing from our speakers their insights around the elections and how we can have more positive, constructive conversations around this time, which is, you know, as we know, it's full of a lot of tension and it's challenging. And then we're going to be doing a little breakout room segment. So for those of you who would like to get into triads, so groups of 3, to reflect on a question that we'll share, just so you can have a moment of mindful dialogue. And then we'll bring you back and hear from you. So either in the chat or, you know, if there's time, maybe have a few people come off mute and on camera. And then we'll close. All right, so I hope that sounds good. And if you have any questions for the speakers at any point, just please pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to see them and to get those questions answered. So I'll just kind of introduce our speakers and then I'll hand it over to Calista, who will be doing our presentation. So starting with Rodney. So Rodney Bryce Campbell is our moderator for today's session, and he's a co-host, comedic relief and chief vision officer at More in Common. And he's known for being professionally unprofessional. And he brings authenticity to everything he does, effortlessly connecting with anyone he encounters. And his mission is to show that meaningful conversations aren't difficult, or meaningful connections rather. They just need a little humor and a lot of compassion. And I would agree with that, Rodney. And then we've got Joan Blades, who is a co-founder of Living Room Conversations. She's also co-founder of allsidesforschools.org, mumsrising.org, and moveon.org. And she's the co-author of The Custom Fit Workplace and The Motherhood Manifesto. And Jack Glazer, he is a professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. A social psychologist, his primary research interest is in stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And he's on California's Peace Officer Standards Accountability Advisory Board and is the author of Suspect Race: Causes and Consequences of Racial Profiling. And last but not least, we have Calista Small, who is research manager at More in Common and leads mixed method studies on a range of topics related to social cohesion and division in the US. And Calista previously worked as a social psychology research assistant at Columbia University, helping to develop and implement studies on emotion and stress. So a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today, sorry. And I will hand the floor over to Rodney and Calista for our presentation.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm just going to give a very brief presentation. So I have some slides for you all. Let me, one moment. Okay, can everybody see this? Great. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm Calista Small, and I'm the research manager for the US team at More in Common. And I'm going to be talking just briefly about polarization and perception gaps in the United States. I recognize we have an international audience here, so I do want to acknowledge that my data that I'm sharing today is just on US adults, though we do see a lot of these trends emerging globally as well. But the reason I'm talking about this is because we're here to talk about conversations and connecting across divides, and I want to kind of build the case and make the case that our perception gaps and our misunderstandings that we have about each other prevent us from connecting and conversing with each other, yet at the same time, that connection is so important for correcting those misperceptions. So before I start though, I just want a quick show of hands. Who here is part of a community that is currently being impacted by polarization or some other form of social division? So as all of us have experienced, toxic polarization is dividing the communities that we really care about. And these have really wide-reaching social implications. It ranges from the smallest things like awkward conversations with family to devastating acts of violence. And it makes it particularly a challenging moment for us to be engaged in the hard work of community building, both online and offline, as even just our daily realities can feel overwhelming, insurmountable, and exhausting. But events like these today are a really important reminder that you are part of a wider movement of nonprofits and researchers and foundations committed to transcending divides and growing and healing communities together. So thank you so much for being here today, and thank you again for having me. Okay, just two more things about my organization, More in Common. So More in Common is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and civic organization. Our mission is to build societies that are stronger, more united, and more resilient to increasing threats of polarization and social division. And we have offices in the UK, France, Germany, Poland, Brazil, and also the US. I work for the US office. And for clarification, Rodney's organization is also called More in Common, and it is fantastic, and he's doing amazing work, but it is different from mine. I'm sure he'll talk more about the work he does too. Okay, so back to the topic at hand, onto the research. To set the context, I'm just going to start by giving a really brief overview about the state of polarization in the US today really quickly, and then I'll explain what perception gaps are and how they inhibit dialogue. So, as we all know, Americans feel intensely divided. So in 2022, that's what this data is from, we asked Americans to choose the top words that they would, to select from this long list of words that we gave them, what the top words they would choose to describe the country. And the majority of them said divided, followed by chaotic and intolerant. And as you can see here, very few Americans use positive words to describe the country, like compassionate or polite or honest. Furthermore, partisan animosity, which is described as feelings of hostility towards one's rival political party, is really, really high right now. This is something we all know and feel in the United States, and I'm sure other members, other people on this call also can feel in their own countries with their own political parties. So in the US, more than 7 in 10 Republicans think Democrats are brainwashed or hateful, and more than 7 in 10 Democrats also think Republicans are brainwashed or hateful. And this partisan animosity has been growing over time. So this graph shows the average feelings of favorability or warmth towards opposing political party members, again in the US, starting in the 1980s and going through 2020. And this is the average feelings of Democrats and Republicans towards their opposing party members. So as you can see, there once was a time where we felt neutrally or somewhat neutrally towards our political opponents, and now we're kind of at record high levels of animosity. And I'm just going to go through these quickly. A lot of research shows that these rising levels of partisan animosity contribute to rising levels of social distrust. It negatively impacts personal relationships, has wide-reaching consequences for democracy, and results in lots of challenges for cross-party collaboration. And this also is linked to lower trust in institutions and support for democratic norms, generally speaking. And in addition, this partisan animosity is contributing to a lot of misunderstandings. So we basically now see our political opponents not as people, but as enemies. And we don't trust enemies, right? And we don't want to interact with them, and we don't want to associate with them. And as a result, we distance ourselves from them and therefore develop misunderstandings about who they are. And these misunderstandings can fuel animosity over time. And there are a lot of structural factors that also contribute to the rise of partisan animosity. And of course, we all know conflict entrepreneurs stoke partisan animosity in order to achieve political or material gain. So there is a lot more going on than the simple diagram shows. I just wanted to illustrate this one point about how partisan animosity can lead to misunderstandings and how this can create a vicious cycle. So at More in Common, we study these misunderstandings and we actually measure them. And when we measure them, we give them a name and we call them perception gaps. So I'm going to just talk a little bit longer about these perception gaps, and then I'll wrap up my little presentation. So we define a perception gap as the difference between what one group thinks another group believes and what the other group actually believes. And since 2019, More in Common has been doing research on perception gaps in a broad range of political topics. And our most recent study on this was actually in 2022. And it was on how Americans think we should teach US history in school, because that was a topic that was in the news during that year and was seen as a very highly controversial and very polarizing topic at the time. So in order to explain what a perception gap is, I'm going to give this very specific example using our data from 2022. So again, this is going to have a US focus. But before I want to show this example, I just want to emphasize that you may find some of the questions we asked in both this study and in other studies that I'm going to show somewhat provocative, and that's actually by design in order to assess beliefs and attitudes. So I just want to say that now because I know it can be somewhat surprising. Okay, so on to my example. Okay, so this is an example of a perception gap. So what you're looking at here in this blue dot is the following. We asked Democrats, how many Republicans do you think would agree with this statement? Americans have a responsibility to learn from our past and fix our mistakes. And Democrats said, we think about 35% of Republicans would agree with that statement. And then we asked Republicans, do you agree with this statement? And 93% of Republicans agree with this statement. So you can see there's this really big gap or misunderstanding between what Democrats think Republicans would believe and what they actually believe. As you can see here in yellow, we also asked independents about this, and independents also have a perception gap as well, but in this case, Democrats have a larger perception gap. So here's another one, again, on the same topic, teaching US history in school. So for this data here, what you're looking at is, first we asked Republicans, how many Democrats do you think would agree with this statement? In learning about American history, students should not be made to see each other as personally responsible for the actions of earlier generations. And Republicans said, we think about 42% of Democrats would agree with that statement. And then we asked Democrats, do you agree with that statement? And 85% of them said, yes, we did. Or yes, we do agree. So again, you can see here, there's this really large perception gap, large percentage of what Republicans think Democrats believe and what they actually believe. And so we have been studying perception gaps, as I mentioned, since 2019. This is some data from 2019. The topics we asked in this study were relevant to a lot of subjects that were being talked about at the time. So as you can see here, this is a perception gap that Democrats have about Republicans' opinion about controlling immigration, for example. So we've asked about a lot of different topics, and we're asking about more topics today. But the point I am trying to make here is that Democrats and Republicans, and to a certain extent independents, have very large misunderstandings of what the other side thinks. And as I mentioned at the beginning, these misperceptions contribute to polarizations and reinforce animosity. So as you can see here, the larger an individual person's average perception gap was, the more negative character judgments they also gave to their opposing political party members. So this is true of both Democrats and Republicans. So again, this goes back to this idea that partisan animosity can lead to more social distancing and misunderstanding, which can then reinforce more animosity and create this vicious cycle. So how can we correct perception gaps? We can do a lot of different things to correct perception gaps. One of the things that you can do is go to a presentation like this and read research on perception gaps and learn more about them. But the most important thing we can do is that we can talk to we can talk to each other, we can talk to one another, we can have conversations, and we can start to get to know people with different political viewpoints than us and learn about the nuances of their opinions. And I think this is the most hopeful and inspiring thing, because this is something you could do today, and you can do it in any country, and it can make a really big difference. So I'm just going to leave with that. Yes, I have one more slide here, my takeaways, just to summarize what I had just presented. We don't actually accurately predict what the other side actually believes. This creates a phenomenon of imagined enemies, and it drives unnecessary division. But conversations across divides can really break the cycle. So I can answer questions on any of the data that I just showed, but I also want to make sure we get on to the rest of the call. So thank you. Oh, thank you so much. I'm having a hard time hearing Rodney. I think are
Oh, I was
there.
muted. That's why I was talking to
Okay.
myself. That was awesome. Thank you, thank you, Calista. That was awesome. And thank you for clarifying. It's like one call, two more comments. Everybody's getting a bonus, and that was fantastic data and information you shared. Um, I think as we go into the election year, just one question for you, real quick, before we start the panel. How is your research relevant? Like, how do you think about it as we go into the election year? Like, is anything specific you pull out of it as we go into this here in the US?
Yes, great question. So I didn't present data on this today because this is not data that More in Common has collected, but we have really large perception gaps around our political opponents' support for democracy. And correcting those perception gaps is really important for reinforcing democratic norms and also reducing support for partisan violence. So we often highly overestimate the amount of support our opposing political party members have towards partisan violence, and also support for anti-democratic behaviors. A lot of political elites are 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 undermining democracy in many ways, but the general public does not support that. And so correcting those perception gaps and making sure we all understand that the American public really is in support of democratic norms and does not support partisan violence is really, really important in an election year.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting pieces of data I've seen from your More in Common in the past few years is the widening of the middle and the people that are undecided either side or slightly affiliated with one side. I think somewhat supporting what you just said there. But let's pull Joan and Jack in and have a little bit of a conversation. Joan, I'd love to start with you and see what did you take from that? Like, what are you thinking about what Calissa just shared as we're looking at perception gaps and some of the animosity, the partisan animosity happening in the world right now? What are you thinking?
Well, I'm somewhat obsessed right now about trust in elections, which is a place where there's a huge amount of agreement. You know, Braver Angels spent 2 years with facilitated conversations left and right and came up with hundreds of consensus points around elections. And so these were not compromise, these were consensus points and 3 principles that, were basically aspirationally in the same place, and yet we have this huge distrust. So for me, for this next month, I am focused on trust in elections. How do we take responsibility locally and build connection and community locally? Because we have power locally and we have the capacity to make sure our elections are trustworthy. And there's been a campaign against trust in elections in the last many years, right? So it's not surprising. There's the desire to have them being trustworthy is pretty universal. And how do we achieve that before the election? I don't want to hear complaints about it after. I want to do something now. And, coming from Move On, I've seen massive engagement really make a big difference. This is a time when I dream of massive engagement where people show up and say, it's going to be good here. And we have the capacity to connect people across country once they do the local work, which is actually kind of beautiful and exciting. So building trust locally, building trust nationally, that's, more in common is, I was sitting there going, oh, we should have conversation guides that go with each one of these topics which you've laid out, because it's an opportunity for people to hear each other's, the way a living room conversation is constructed is to help people really listen to each other's personal stories about the topic at hand and not get into the political talking points, which kind of put us in a political trance where we cease to be receptive.
Yeah.
So this is my dream for the next month. And
you bring some great points. Trust. It's so thinking about what you said, and Calissa, what you shared, there's always been wedge issues, right? Like issues used to split people up to one side or another, which is interesting because there's only 2 sides, right? And this is really not, but that's how it's been made to seem. And then it seems like you take some of those questions that Calista shared with us. There's like everything is a huge wedge, and the wedge has widened over the past few years, over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And that is very it's a little discouraging. Jack, hi, how are you? What does this leave you with thinking? What are you thinking about, and what are you taking from this thus far, and what are you working on right now?
Yeah, well, as a social psychologist, one of the things that keeps coming to mind for me to help understand, this separation and this distrust is the increasingly sort of tribal nature of politics in America, and this sense that we're distinct groups as opposed to all being Americans working toward the same goals. And I'm not sure when it started. I mean, it's always sort of been there, but it's really gotten very pronounced in recent decades. And what that does psychologically is it causes people to differentiate. When people believe they belong to one group and that others belong to another group, they seek to differentiate those groups from each other to keep their thoughts about life more simple and manageable. And then what they also do is they tend to overestimate the homogeneity of the other group and to kind of overestimate the heterogeneity of their own group. And then you combine with that our tendencies toward confirmation bias, which is where we're more likely to, pay attention to and hear and notice and remember information that's consistent with the way we already see the world. Adding to that we're already now living in these very isolated media environments where we choose our own media and we choose our own news stream. So all of those things, I think, kind of, well, and I should add, and there are also some bad faith actors in there who are promulgating misinformation. But even without that, I think you would see a lot of this polarization and distrust. And it's caused by a lot of different things. And when we think about what the solutions are, we've got to think about how we address those causal factors.
That is well said. You left us with a lot there. Confirmation bias, isolation, media, bad faith actors. You also said something. I had a conversation yesterday with some friends. I'm not sure when it's all started. Like how much of this is new versus how much of this is been happening. But I think Calista showed us some really sharp trends that we were pretty in the middle in the 80s through to the 90s, and then there's this sharp rise in the polarization and the separation or the perception gaps, I should say.
And I can't help but comment on Joan's and I want to hear Joan's thoughts on this, but I've never seen those data before, but on the fly, what I saw was an uptick in 1992. And I do think that there was something about the transition from Reagan Bush to Clinton. And then, Joan founded MoveOn.org, which was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was let's move on from all this impeachment and investigation stuff and get back to the business of running the country and having a healthy society and democracy. And it seems like that's kind of an inflection point. That's about where it is. And I'm not sure again what we do with that information, but it has something to do with the weaponization of politics and the justice system to promote political ends. That I think is a little bit of where we are right now.
Joan, any thoughts on that?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on that.
Please regale us.
I mean, Move On was midway in the impeachment scandal, and it was center and move on to pressing issues facing the country. And that was back when we believed Congress had work to do and could do it. I mean, at the time, it was, you could love Clinton or hate Clinton and agree that was a unifying message, that let's get back to work. It was like common sense, let's do this. I do believe one of the people in the comments was noting the media. Our media has become sorted, and we've become sorted. I live in Berkeley, California. And, if I want to talk to Republicans, I have to be very intentional about it. And that's in early 2000s, it's like, why aren't conservatives concerned about the climate? That was my question. And I was able to have really good conversations with leaders on the right and make friends. By 2008, it was harder to do that. So this self-sorting, all the modeling of bad behaviors in our way of treating each other has made us afraid to have those relationships, which are, having the media sorted is one bad thing, but having our social interactions also sorted really doubles down on that. And, we gotta own this, and we gotta start with, okay, these are the things we can do together. And it's a building trust process from elections to everything else that we've got to do together.
That 100% true. I want to throw a question. So I'm seeing questions. I will get to or as many of these as I can. Calista, this one's for you. How do you distinguish between what they actually believe versus what they say they believe? Or do you?
We take our respondents' answers at face value. And so if people say that they agree with a statement on our surveys, we assume that they do. Of course, there's some social desirability bias when people take surveys, so that always is a factor. And so you can never truly know if someone is being honest on a survey. But I think, at least in my own experience, talking to opposing political party members or talking with people, to people who have political viewpoints who are different, that are different than mine, reaffirms my own, makes me feel intellectually humble. Which is to say, I am consistently confronted with the fact that I don't really understand the people's political viewpoints as much as I think that they do. But in terms of our data, we just take our participants' answers at face value.
It's interesting because that question somewhat seems to reflect the idea of trust and trustworthiness and the actual perception gap that you're talking about in the initial study. Because if I don't think they think this, and then they say they think it, and then I don't believe it, the gap has maybe even widened more. But I thought that was interesting. Thank you for the thoughts on that. Calissa, did you want to add any comments or thoughts to anything that Jack or Joan said prior? Because I thought I saw you tracking some of the things. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Oh, I'm just agreeing. I'm loving hearing both of them talk. So
yeah, no, it's fascinating. A question for all three of you, and we can go kind of round robin. What are you seeing in your own friend, family, work groups with regards to all of this and conversations? Or is there a large avoidance in general? Is there healthy conversation and dialogue happening? What are you seeing?
I'll say I'm seeing a lot of avoidance. It tends to be in this, in the interest of maintaining relationships, there's avoidance of political topics when there is not agreement. And then it's also really interesting to see how people sort of make inferences about a political agreement and use their stereotypes. So if you're in Berkeley, you're kind of pretty safe talking politics with people because you've got a pretty good chance they're going to agree with you. If you're in, further out in the East Bay of the Bay Area, then, you'd have to wonder. But I think people are really careful because it's so volatile and it's so incendiary that they're really trying to avoid getting into fights over that. And I think that will lessen as the election day gets closer. I hope people will start picking some fights so they can change some minds or at least motivate some people to vote.
Anybody? Joan, what about you? What are you seeing?
Well, yeah, I find people need to talk about it, their fears. There's a lot of anxiety and living in Berkeley, there is within that group of friends a lot of consensus. And we know that when we talk to our friends who feel the same way we do, that it actually deepens our sense of being right. And so there's
confirmation bias.
Well, not just confirmation bias, it confirms that we are so right and they are so wrong, right? So when we have people doing living room conversations about something like guns and responsibility or abortion, we don't want a group of like-minded people in that conversation because it just causes them to think those people are, so wrong. We want people to really hear each other. So it's my friendships outside of Berkeley, which I have to keep alive. And, it's about having that personal relationship, people that I love, that I know about their families, I know about what they care about. And I will gently ask about different political things where I think we see things differently, because I really do want to understand how this wonderful person sees this differently. And, I can say my friend Jacob put climate change on his list of concerns years ago, not because I was so persuasive, but because he cares about me. And he cares about another friend. That when the people we care about have something that they care deeply about, it just is our human nature. And this is right for the Global Compassion Coalition, right? Because this is part of our compassionate nature. So we keep on thinking it's about our heads. And my ongoing message is, not sure it's about our heads. I think it's more about our hearts. And hence, my reason for loving the compassion approach. I think that's a beautiful way to approach what we really need to do.
Mm. That's wonderful. Yeah, I've experienced that personally. That's wonderful. Callista, what about you? What are you saying?
Well, I have many close family members who have wildly different political opinions than me. And my family lives in a battleground state in the United States. They live in Wisconsin. I actually have been spending a lot of time there doing some get out the vote efforts. And so that's very different from the world I live in. I currently live in Brooklyn, and my friends in Brooklyn think very differently than my family members. And it's been very hard over the past 10 years to maintain good relationships with everybody that I love very much. But I have, and in fact, I think we've all grown stronger as a result. And that's been because of a lot of very intentional effort. I wanted to name a few things that at least I've experienced, and I know that many others experience when entering conversations with people who have different political viewpoints than them. It's really emotionally activating, right? So in a few very reliable ways. So on the negative side, people fear saying the wrong thing. They fear failing to live up to their own image of themselves as a smart and informed person. They fear discomfort of acute conflict. They fear that they won't be able to regulate their own emotions. They're unsure about why they're talking with this person, what the engagement is, what the purpose is, and they're often really deeply angry at their political opponent. So there's a lot of negative emotions, but there are also a lot of positive ones, and I've experienced those as well in many conversations with my family members. And so the positive moments are excitement, right? So you're excited about getting to talk about an issue in a really meaningful way with somebody. And you're hungry to share your personal experience about your relationship to the political issue and why you have the opinions that you do. And you're also really curious about, as Joan was saying, about what the other person believes. And there's definitely a desire for compassion, perspective taking. And as a result, I've gotten to know my family members much better. And I have stepped into their shoes and understood their perspectives and their experiences. And because I'm curious, I want to know why they arrived at these conclusions. So I think naming this complex mix of emotions and motivations can really help to frame this very challenging thing, which is to talk with people, especially people that you know well, about political topics, and especially when you disagree. But naming these emotions can really help calm nerves and open people up for learning and constructive dialogue.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's super helpful. So there was a question in here about and someone noting that it can be really hard because we're all in our own echoing chambers or our own echo chambers, and that's been brought up, especially Joan, you're talking about having a diversity of thought at a table. Jack, you brought up confirmation bias, and so the question is, any advice? How do we? And I think, Calissa, you mentioned some seeking different news outlets or seeking different sources of information, but maybe just running down the line and talking through some of the things that you three actively do and or recommend to others to help maybe get outside of their own echo chamber, so that they can continue. And Calissa, you also say conversations with people on either side. But what other things do you all have?
I just put a link to all sides in the chat because I really do use this to get a sense of, it has news of the day, left, right, and center on the same topic side by side. And it's just okay. And sometimes it's similar what's being reported, and sometimes it's a very different perspective. I learn a lot that way.
I guess I'll add, I don't have any good strategies for this personally, and I'm just terrible at it. But I will again fall back into my comfort zone, which is the psychological science. And there's a large political psychology literature on emotion and politics. And one of the things we know is that this is true in general and in politics. Anger is a really toxic, bad emotion, and we know that for what it causes us to do, but it also causes us to process information very poorly, and to use the more sort of lizard part of our brains. And fear is as well. But fear can be spoken to with hope, and anger is really just hard to reach. So I would encourage people to go into these conversations, try to check their anger, however they can do that, and also to go into it in listening mode. I think that's something that is sort of manageable for people to do. You can't just turn off your anger, but you can't say, I'm gonna listen. And you can remind yourself to listen. And eventually you get to join the conversation. But if you're listening, you're receptive, and the other person will respond positively to that as well.
Awesome. Callista, anything else you want to add?
Wow. I mean, there are so many things. We could talk about this for such a long time. I guess what I just mentioned, which is that naming these emotions and what Jack just said, like really checking in with yourself and trying to label your own emotions that you're feeling is really important so that you can have a conversation with somebody where that is constructive. So you really are able to listen to them and they're able to listen to you. And I'm a really big fan of deep listening, which is a skill set that it combines both regular active listening skills, such as like making sure you're making eye contact with the person, and also like you don't have any devices out and you're like showing attentiveness, and also like a general stance of unconditional positive regard for the speaker. And I think that's really important. It's a really important part of listening, because if you can show somebody that you are open to them, they will feel less defensive. And research has shown that actually that also makes them less susceptible to like extreme forms of thinking. So I think deep listening is a really important tool. It's something that we can all improve on, and can really help, at least help in many ways in these conversations, but also help when you're doing listening, help the person feel like you are creating an impact just by listening to someone and showing that you care and you have a positive regard towards them.
I think so. Everything you all said is wonderful, and I think that last one hits home for me, because I think I've experienced times where it doesn't seem like listening is an action. And because of that, it's like, oh, I got to get to doing something. I got to get to convincing. I got to get to letting them know what I think. When starting with that is shown, so I'm sure Jack can help me with the psychological science on it, is shown to push people away when I'm ready to share what I want to know, what I want to say before I'm ready to listen. And the tool that I like to use and one that I teach is the steel man, which is very opposite of the straw man. And it is the idea of taking everything that you just said and repeating it back verbatim, if not with a level of deeper understanding, so that when you hear me say it, your response is, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. That's exactly what I'm saying. And it's not with that like sarcastic, like, well, you think this, because that'll push people away. But it is an honest, earnest, good faith response of what the other party says, so that we can start. And there's a comment in here, so we can start from the same place. And then from there, we can disagree all we want. But I got to at least make sure I understand what we're disagreeing about when we start. And that actually draws people in. Like just hearing them is going to give them an opportunity to say, like, okay, well, you're not going to twist my words and take what I say for granted. So, okay, I'll share honestly what I think. And then we can go from there. That's just something that I found is helpful. I know we are probably going to look at breakout rooms in a moment, but I want to look through the questions and see if there's another one I can sneak in. There's so many good questions. Question one thing, fortunately.
While you're looking, I'm
Yes.
going to make one comment on that. I've noticed that it can be really hard to repeat something that you disagree with deeply in an accurate way.
Because
It's
we're afraid that saying it means we believe it.
not even that, it just doesn't stick the same way, right? If there's any complexity to it, it just like, it's harder. I have to work a lot harder.
For sure. For sure. I had a boss in sales once. They had this amazing ability to, especially when something was very difficult and hard to understand, like in an emotional part of a negotiation. And they would just say, "Hey, can I repeat back what I think I heard?" So that just immediately said, like, if I get this wrong, please correct me. And then when it was wrong, the other person could step in and say, "Oh, no, I actually said this." And it's like, "Oh, okay, let me try that again." And then getting it right, like taking kind of the pressure off of the situation, it really helps a lot.
Yeah.
And I think if you can go into a conversation, and this is just good for your soul, but if you can go into a conversation recognizing that you may be wrong, that your belief may be the wrong belief. And I don't even
That's
know if
just
it's true,
silly.
because I might be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong while I'm saying this, but that opens you up again, and it makes you a better listener, and it creates healthy humility.
I feel like this is a really good question to kind of sum this up as we get ready to do some breakouts. So I'm going to do rapid fire. I'll go down the line. Joan, Jack, Callista. How can we be there for one another, even through our disagreements, so that we can bring consolation and create a safe space? Safe space is where we haven't actually said a whole lot, but I think it's what we're talking about in a lot of this. So what maybe a couple quick thoughts on that, so we can create some breakouts. So Joan, what's your thought on that?
I think the listening is a really good space to be in for that. It's really listening to someone's powerful.
And I think, just remembering that we're all human and we're all fallible, and we feel pain and joy, and we need to have compassion for each other. That's a good place to start.
Callista?
Yes, I definitely agree. And also it depends on the space that you're constructing, but if it is a formal space, of course, setting community norms is extremely important. And leaders can set norms, organizations can set norms, but even among your friend group, you can subtly set norms of like, what is compassionate behavior and what would contribute to more animosity.
And there was a thing you said, I think it was intellectual humility. I think just humility, back to that, we're all human. Like looking at that perception gap, like for me, it's kind of easy for me to think like, oh, I don't know what they're thinking. Or there's a really good chance I don't know what they're thinking. All I want to know is what they're thinking. And then from there I can go on. So I really appreciate that. Let's do some breakout groups. And let's oh wait, hold on. I'm getting notes from the moderator, or from the tech lead. Hi, Rachel. I'm getting notes. Wait, hold on. We're reading call on our ear. What were you thinking, Rachel?
Well, yeah, I just wondered if we wanted to stay as a group, and maybe I can pop the questions in the chat for people to reflect on, and then if anyone wants to unmute and share their thoughts, just in terms of time, because I know we're kind of coming up to the hour. We are going to go over slightly by 5 minutes or so, but I think the breakouts might be pushing it. So is everyone all right with that?
Staying as a group? Everybody okay with that?
All right, I'll pop the questions in the chat.
Silence as acceptance. Awesome. We'll get questions here. What have you done to stay connected with people you care about who have different political perspectives? How can we better maintain and create relationships and work towards healthy communities? Fantastic question. Maybe we use the If anybody wants to raise hands and maybe come off mute and share things that they've done. If not, I'm gonna popcorn it over to one of our panelists.
Oh, we've got Naomi.
Oh yeah,
Right.
yeah, Noemi.
Yes, thank you so much for this. I was so ready to hear a discussion about this topic without it getting into the whole election thing and outcomes thing. So this is really helpful for me. I have had three, more than three conversations with three people. And the last one, in fact, was just 2 days ago, coincidentally. And we were visiting very close family friends who actually live in Canada, but they're very, I am, and we are here in the family, very firm Democratic voters, and our friends are, rooting from afar for the Republican side. And they're the ones who, they're my parents' generation, so they don't really hesitate bringing up these difficult topics. But every time I've had these conversations, and first of all, it takes tremendous inner resources to go to do this. Well, I think that one can approach it in a stepwise way. Either, I think even if you make just, even if the topic is opened and closed, at first, it still sends a positive message, and it still takes tremendous inner courage to go there. And but another lesson I learned 2 days ago is that it is important to have time and space for the conversation to evolve. And that was actually the case. I think the time and space was available, and it automatically kind of, we weren't planning on having these conversations, but it was kind of easier for such things, for people to feel more comfortable getting into these types of conversations. So it's and then I think that daring to take little steps and not stopping, and not losing courage to take another step in the future just because the step was tiny, or because it, expectations weren't met, or whatever, is important. And, it's always been really surprising that I've always found common ground in ways that, these perception gaps beautifully illustrate. I mean, it really is to the point where, like in this last conversation, we were actually able to agree that it seems that politicians aren't really about the solutions to the problems we care about, because we can agree on the solutions. We brought up some of the issues with immigration, and so within a conversation, we were more human, more nuanced. We were able to I'm getting an echo, but hopefully no one else does. We were able to really listen and keep coming back to the conversation with more questions, with curiosity, and bring our discomfort along for the ride. But then, and I'm thinking about this as I'm sitting here listening, ultimately the choice that we make are black and white, right? We're asked to vote for this or that candidate. And this is when that question popped into my mind. Wait a minute, is that my intention, is to create a vote? Maybe maybe that's where a lot of the disappointment comes from, is that we think we have to have a conversation and then convince the other person so that they go and vote for the way that we would vote. And so I was glad to hear some of the responses back that said, connection and really realizing that, especially in the context of the Compassion Coalition, we're not about rushing anything. I mean, the die has been cast for this election in the US, and people are doing the work that needs to be done, and the outcome will be the outcome. We want to be able to go back to these people and these connections and continue engaging them, because there's like parallel tracks. So I'm really proud of myself, actually, that I was able to have these conversations and steer them with my own effort and with cooperation on the other side in the direction of, more objective stuff. And like in this conversation, we could agree that the politicians aren't really doing a good job for either one of us. That was like mind-blowing for me to realize that we could agree on that. So it's that's what I've done, and I really it doesn't have the satisfaction that I'm looking for, because satisfaction means things will change tomorrow and everyone will start acting differently. And
but it's great work. I mean, I think that's something you should be proud of. It's not like, and thank you for sharing that. I think you asked a good question, like what was the intention going into the conversation? I think that's something that I'm gonna take out of this, so I appreciate you sharing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Arjun, I hope I said your name correct.
Yes.
I'm gonna get you in real quick. I know we only have a couple. For those of you who may have to leave, I know we're 2 minutes past time, so if you need to leave, thank you for joining us. But those who can stick around for a couple minutes, please do. Arjun.
Oh, yeah, just to also address the question. So for me personally, I find that what's helped has been just a posture of vulnerability. And I think the two sort of concrete places where that's happened is by saying, hey, I don't know everything about this candidate. Could you help me understand? And then also, when engaging in quote unquote disagreements, actually leveraging the other point of view to sort of assuage your fear. So like if somebody, the person who supported the opposite candidate, I would say, hey, like, I want to just be very honest with you. I'm really nervous about this and this and this, because here's what I've heard. Like, can you please speak to that? And then it becomes less, accusatory, which I think is unfortunately the rhetoric that often happens in the political context. So I've found that the vulnerability has been helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying there is really kind of depolarizing the conversation and like taking some of the heat out of it. Also doing what Calista said, naming, I'm feeling nervous about this, or I'm feeling fear about this. Can you help me? Which is enlisting their help to like, you're asking for their opinion in a way that is, as you said, vulnerable. So that's really cool. So I think we're gonna try and wrap up here. Maybe Rachel, would you be okay with it going around and maybe getting some final thoughts from our panelists, or how did you want to wrap?
Yeah, that would be great. Go ahead.
Awesome. Okay. Well, let's run down the line. I think we've got an order set. Joan, Jack, Callista. So let's do it. Joan, what do you want to leave us with? What would you ask us to think about as we continue on towards this election here in the US? Oh, you're muted. That's how you know it's good. That's how you know it's gold, because she's on mute.
That question we just had was from one of our living room conversations. So have one of the conversations, and the conversation agreements coupled with the guide create a really nice context for deep conversation with 4 to 6 people, and it's really fun. So this and I put a link to our newest conversation, which is literally about listening. And then that will be something you take with you out into the rest of your relationships, because it's really a skill building. And I think this is a group that has those skills in large part already, but never hurts to hone them a little more.
Sure. Thank you for that. Jack?
I guess I feel compelled to say that I would want to separate all of this into at least 2 different categories. And one of them would be relationship repair and relationship maintenance. And the other would be political action, political effect. And in an ideal world, those 2 would merge perfectly, and you could have good conversations with people and get them to vote for your candidate. But I think given the time frame we're facing right now, if you care about the outcome of the election, you might want to put most of your effort into turning out people who are going to vote like you. And work on, but that doesn't mean that you have to choose between that and the relationship repair, and hopefully that latter part will move us toward, you know, less polarization down the road as we learn to talk to each other. So that's what I would add.
I have a thought about that, but that I'm going to share it real quick. I would say it's not a zero-sum game. My best friend and I, who is my business partner at More in Common, we started with diametrically opposed views on the world, like finance, politics, like anything you could think of. And through our mutual respect of each other and our relationship and our willingness to listen, without even saying like, hey, man, you really need to change your view on this, there's been places where we flip positions just over time, just because it's happened naturally out of just being willing to hear and consider the other side. And it's not zero sum. And I think Noemi said it, like, it feels like it's not success if it didn't happen in this conversation, which isn't necessarily true. But Callista, take us home. You opened, take us home.
My goodness. Well, I just want to thank everyone so much for being here. The fact that you're here means that you care, and means that you are already working to repair division. So that's a really big deal. And also, we are very close to the election. And so when you do vote, text 3 other people that you know and tell them, and make sure that they also vote. It's called vote tripling. It's a really great strategy. It makes the impact of your vote exponentially increase. It increases the impact of your vote. So talk to people in your life, tell them to vote. That's really, really, really important. And when you have those conversations and when you come across disagreements, make sure you listen and you have an unconditional positive regard for them, so that after this election, we can rebuild this trust. I mean, we need to be building the trust now, as Joan was saying, but we need to rebuild the trust not only in our institutions and our elections, but also in each other, so that we never reach this level of division and dysfunction again. And awesome. You can do it. You're already doing it. You're here. So thank you.
So much good advice. Vote tripling. I just learned something new.
Yes, vote tripling. Tell 3 people at least, and then tell them to tell 3 people.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Appreciate you all. Thank you all for coming. Rachel said that the recording will be shared, so we can go back, and I will try and put together some. I've been taking notes, so I will try and put together a summary of all the wonderful tips, tools, tricks, ideas that you can all take, because it's hard, as Jack said, when we get activated and we're not in the prefrontal cortex, where we can't make the best logical, rational decisions in a conversation. We need some things to remind us. So thank you all for being here. Have some grace with yourself and with everybody else, and let's have a good rest of the day and rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.